Hello and welcome to This Week in the News. I'll begin with last week's CNN article, What is DEI and Why is it Dividing America? Author Niquelle Terry Ellis says that diversity, equity, and inclusion programming is under attack in boardrooms, state legislatures, and college campuses across the country. Ellis refers to the 81 anti-DEI bills targeting programs at colleges just in the last year. 8 have been signed into law in states like Texas and Florida. In the workplace, more than half of all employees say that they've either participated in DEI programming or meetings at work, and 33% say that their company has designated a staff member to promote DEI. I actually once held that role at a global pharmaceutical company. DEI is on the chopping block, and that suggests that critics don't see the good in the programming, or worse, that's not a vision they share. For instance, in the workplace, DEI education helps employees better understand and bridge cultural differences. It's also good for business growth strategy to ensure that the employer workforce actually reflects its customer base. And if you don't think that matters, you should look into the Human Rights Campaign and the app they created a good 2 decades ago, designating LGBTQIA friendly brands and employers. Moving to higher education, one of the benefits is prioritizing and embracing a diverse student body allows students to interact with peers from different walks of life and learn new perspectives both in and outside of the classroom. So what's the threat to DEI? The biggest threat to DEI and equity programming across every dimension of diversity is the U.S. Supreme Court. Some argue, and I'm inclined to agree, that what we saw happen in education is a precursor for what we will see for employment. So last summer, we saw this historic decision play out in the Supreme Court, which ended race-conscious admission programs at colleges and universities across the country. It was the 6-justice conservative supermajority who collectively invalidated admission programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina. That ruling essentially ended the ability for any college or university, either private or public, to consider race as one of the many factors in deciding which of their qualified applicants would be admitted. So how does all of that impact employment? Well, an NPR interview with Harvard law professor Noah Feldman explains that Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote an additional concurrence to say that, in his view, there was no reason for the law to be different for employers than it is for universities because, quote, they use extremely similar words to prohibit discrimination, end quote. The justice's opinion, which he made crystal clear, is if racial diversity is no longer permissible justification for affirmative action in higher ed admissions, which is a Title VI provision under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, then it would no longer be a permissible justification for considering racial diversity as a part of affirmative action in hiring, which is covered under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Dr. Feldman explained that when lawyers advise their company leaders or their clients, not only do they have to interpret the law, but they also have to interpret the direction in which laws are headed. In this case, Dr. Feldman argues that the writing is on the wall. Quote, there's a very high probability that a majority of this current Supreme Court will say the exact same thing that it said in the case of Title VI about Title VII. And indeed, Dr. Feldman believes that some of the courts and companies and lawyers would probably take this into account, that the court has already done enough to make it very clear that you can no longer use racial diversity as an objective in workplace hiring. So what this means is that some companies will no longer consider that if, for example, they have roughly 2 comparable candidates and one candidate adds racial diversity to the workplace, that hiring them for that reason could become problematic because they'll be concerned that the courts will find that unlawful discrimination. And as a result, Dr. Feldman believes that HR departments everywhere will begin to issue guidance to employees saying that this is not how it's going to be done anymore. So where does that leave DEI and the question of equitable hiring practices, including age? The outcome of the November election will be key in determining the future for DEI. And even then, quite honestly, if President Biden is reelected, the Supreme Court seems to be on a tear to undermine everything that has previously been accomplished in the equity space. In the end, it could look like the Wild West when it comes to employment opportunities. Whoever shows up with what it takes to get the job done has the best chance of getting it. Why? Because employers are hurting for talent they can count on. But employers will also have the freedom to create the workplace they want, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it reflects. In time, we could, I know this sounds crazy and it sounds like a stretch, but seriously, in time, we could have segregated workplaces and educational institutions just like we had 100 years ago. I know that sounds crazy, but think about human nature. People fear what they don't understand. One of the best outcomes of DEI programming is that it gave people this chance to understand through education, training, internal communications, employee resource groups, events, and activities that when we peel our skin back, we all look the same. And ultimately, we all want the same things. That's opportunity, safety, the ability to be able to provide for ourselves and our families. Before I go, last week the OECD released a new report on the importance of employee mobility. In other words, the ability for employees to move within a company. I'll be talking about that in much more detail very soon, and I'll be sure to share the link to the report and all the articles I've referenced in the show notes. Thanks to Kim Anderson, CEO of GraySource, who forwarded me the article, What is DEI and Why is it Dividing America? GraySource is a certified DEI recruitment and hiring agency where age is an asset and diversity is more than a trend. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you next week on This Week in the News. This Week in the News is sponsored by Age Equity Alliance, a Texas-based 501c3 working globally with progressive companies to competitively attract, develop, and retain talent across the age spectrum. You can follow Age Equity Alliance on LinkedIn, listen to our podcasts on Spotify, or visit the website at ageequityalliance.org.